2017. The global economy and the trading regime also remain as unbalanced, and underscoring that we really need to put more effort into fair globalization and inclusive growth. Youth unemployment combined with a lack of relevant skills is absolutely at alarming levels. And again, I'd say relevant skills because the education system is not catching up, nor are we having the investments in the quality and the skills that are needed for young people to come in and participate in the economy. In fact, in my country, I can say very clearly that many children are going through education, and education is not passing through them. They're coming out as qualified illiterates. They're holding pieces of paper that give them a sense that they are educated in dignity, only to find out they cannot connect and they cannot find a place in the economy. And so this disenfranchisement with prevailing governance structures and social norms, which are all on the rise, are really straining our social cohesion and solidarity. It's breeding intolerance, extremism, nationalism, and xenophobia, which are all on the rise at levels that we have never seen, and sometimes perhaps isolated from, because we live mostly in a world where you're not really communicating with people. You're seeing all of this in the new social media and ways of communication. Reports from such networks as Scholars at Risk, outlining violent and coercive attacks on higher education communities across the globe, are also quite alarming. Trust is on the decline, and leadership seems to be in short order too. There was a recent survey done by the Edelman group on trust. What was interesting for us there was to see government go down with the media in trust amongst communities, but to see the increase in trust with business and with the UN. And I think that here we need not to take that as a given, that that may just be as transient as the rest, and we need to invest in the reasons why that trust has been gained over time, particularly when we talk about business. It is in this context that this conference has asked whether the liberal world order is ending, and certainly the best way, we believe, to uphold that order is to defend the values on which it is based. And I was researching to see, what would we say are the core values of the UN? What would we say are the core values of multilateralism? And there was never any one answer. It was really quite amazing that everybody had different answers to this. And I'm sure in 1945, when we put pen to paper on the Charter, that it wasn't so. And so I wonder in question time whether I would have a chance to ask you, what do you think the core values are of the United Nations? It would be really interesting to see what feedback you give. So start thinking about that now. We were created just after the World War, and it was to promote international cooperation, maintain international order. And the UN has been trying to do that. It's shared values of integrity, accountability, transparency, respect, do no harm. But all the things that we've tried to do relying on the three pillars that hold us up: human rights and development and peace and security. Have they been doing well? Well, despite rising criticism, the UN has been playing a critical role in the service of our global humanity. We are saving lives, millions from the deepest of poverty, to treating children from preventable diseases, to providing much-needed food, education and shelters to the most vulnerable, to empowering girls and women, and fighting climate change. Many, many more things that we are doing well. However, in today's world, we face so many more challenges, very complex. They are testing the United Nations values, our shared values, I hope. They're testing our collective responsibility. So I believe that we've never been more relevant and needed to protect than now multilateralism. I grew up at a time when the struggle against apartheid was front and center, and I was showing our colleagues today a picture that was sent to me, and it was 4 men who were in the front line of that struggle, and it was in Soweto. And when we looked at that picture, all 4 of those men today have become presidents of South Africa. A picture of Cyril Ramaphosa, a picture of Nelson Mandela in there, of Thabo Mbeki, and of course Jacob Zuma. Did they ever know that they would be presidents of South Africa? And looking back, the man that led them, how close did they stand to his values as they've gone through? I hope Cyril, and wish him the best of luck, because the times have changed and we are all challenged in leadership. That effort took, of course, years to succeed, and the cost of brave men and women who stood their ground to defend human dignity and equality. Global solidarity played an enormous role in aiding South Africans to their victory. I remember that in my country, public servants paid taxes towards that effort. We were all taxed at that point. Today, I believe that our values are betrayed not only by the atrocities that we see in Syria and Myanmar, South Sudan, but by hatred that's directed at refugees and migrants, by the gender discrimination that we see, sexual abuse and violence that still holds back half of humanity, and by real extreme poverty that blights so many lives, and by so much else, of course. So today, the world is not in a good place, and Antonio often says to me it's pretty messy, and I keep reminding him that's not a diplomatic word in the United Nations. But it's one I think we all understand when we say what's the state of the world, and you start using all sorts of acronyms and posh English. But no, it's not in a good place. It is in a pretty big mess. But fortunately, we do have tools. We do have commitments which have been translated in an ambitious and an inspiring plan to address this and other ills, and to place the world on track. And that for us is the 2030 Agenda, the 17 goals that we have and 169 targets. There's encouraging momentum behind it. It did actually take us 4 years to get there, and it was deep negotiations in different constituencies. It was the first time that member states opened up those halls and invited civil society in all the way to the end, invited business into the room in languages that we didn't understand. They didn't understand us, we didn't understand them. So at a point we were speaking past each other. But today the momentum that has been held for the Sustainable Development Goals is being done by civil society and business. The hope that accompanied the adoption in 2015 is still with us, and I think, Malala at the time said the world needs change and it cannot change itself. It is about me, it is about you, it is about all of us who have to bring that change. So she was underscoring the collective responsibility and putting a few more words into collective responsibility. And it was amazing. Anyone who's been in the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations, there's a balcony. And what we had was her with about 200 young people speaking down to the leaders. So leaders had to look up to youth, and I think that was appropriate in 2015 for a new agenda. The 17 goals that capture the imagination of leaders and general public alike. Individually, I was asked which was my favorite, and I say they're like my kids. Each and every one of them is different, but together they're amazing. So don't separate them. They are interrelated, and they've all got value to add in one way or another. The first 6 are really about the unfinished business of the MDGs, so we didn't reinvent the wheel. We acknowledged that we had not finished the 8 MDGs, and what we did was strengthen those MDGs in the first 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we then took those 3 strands of the social, the economic, and the environment, and underpinned it, held it up with governance and with partnerships. And if you look at all of that, you will see that from Goal 7 all the way through to 15, it's about how we can transform our economies much more inclusively, taking cognizance of the environment, and therefore produce the kind of revenues that we need to see, not band-aids, to actually deliver on rights and services, education, health, water and sanitation, and so much more. So it is a unique roadmap for all of us. It acknowledges that it's about a global agenda. It's the first time that's happened. Development has normally been about us in the north looking down at those in the south. This is about looking in the mirror for everyone to see what role they play in what is a global village, and for which the United Nations is the town hall. Member states are showing strong ownership, and so in as much as we feel that multilateralism is really being shaken up and challenged, we're seeing enough engagement by heads of state and government, and civil society pushing government to say, well, really, do you think that's the kind of progress we're making? And they're allowed in the halls now because they participated in this agenda. So the ownership of this agenda and holding people to account has been a big part of the success of laying out those 17 goals. Local authorities and responsible businesses are seizing the opportunities of climate action. In this country, when the government said no to the Paris Agreement, businesses and local governments said yes. And that's really where the action happens. That's where the investments are made. That's where the changes in lifestyles will happen. So for us, we again underscored the importance of collective responsibility. Everyone in this room has got something to add. 9 to 5, after 5, you are one of the 7.5 billion. What's your contribution to life after? So young people and others in civil society are taking on responsibilities on the sustainability movement. I have to say this has been a challenge for us to try to see how to bring young people into this agenda. We're always talking about your future, but the future's now. And how do you engage with that at the local level? And so we have a wonderful young person who is our envoy at the United Nations, helping to make some reality out of that, so that when we are implementing, we're doing it together with you and not just for you. It becomes very much a part of what you have to think going forward. I said to a number of young people as I came back from northeast Nigeria a couple of months ago, I went into the camp, 75% of the kids there, or 75% of the population were kids under the age of 14. And then I was talking to young people who were probably about 26, 27, 30, 32, and saying, well, your real problem is back there. There are children there that are going to be your problem. How are you going to think about how they will now grow up and engage with the society and the economy? We've seen a lot of support in discussing the whole nature and participation in a multilateral world of the philanthropic, scientific and academic communities who are contributing now solutions and innovation in ways they haven't done before. Known as the ivory towers, I think people have come out of those towers. We really pushed academia when we shaped these goals. And we would go in there and they'd say, so what do you want us to do for you? And they said, well, it's about all of us. And what you have here, the assets that you have here, need to be shared. But there needs to be a responsibility for you to see what happens when they go out your door and where they land in a full cycle of bringing them back in again to improve what we've had, just in case it hasn't quite fallen right. In the universal agenda, there is no one size that fits all. At the same time, we see these huge, complex challenges. We know that the clock is ticking. And let me just pause to give an example. When I walked into the UN as Deputy Secretary General, I said to Antonio, there are two places that I would like to take up with special interest. And as I said them to him, he just said, "Lua, good luck." One of them was Haiti. And it's recognized as a basket case by every perspective that you can take it. And the other one was Sahel in Africa. And both very complex places. But a few days ago, what we witnessed in our endeavor to try to support Haiti, there is no reason Haiti should be the basket case it is today. We find a new government there, a new leader who is a businessman, who wants to make good in his country, but he's faced by enormous challenges. Even if he wants to be the straightest person there is, he faces governance challenges where corruption will fight back. He also faces huge challenges where expectations are high because he's young. And so they really are looking forward to things happening yesterday. The dividends of democracy must be on their tables in their lives, with jobs within a very short space of time. Yet we, as the international community, have gone in there with all sorts of asks of a country that can barely stand up by itself. We finally found a way in which the UN would respond to Haiti, not because of the earthquakes or because of the poverty and the governance issues and the bad leadership they've had in the past, but because we also owed a debt with the cholera tragedy that happened in Haiti. And in doing that, we have a wonderful woman who has put together a group of people, and we invited the government to New York to say, let's sit down and talk about, in spite of your economic challenges, we could put some financial instruments together to bring investments in to people's lives and try to end cholera and put in the infrastructure that would ensure that. Again, challenge, because we had a tension in the UN where we must hold those three pillars equally. We must have a balance to the three of these pillars in any country that we go to. Here we were with a mission that was downgrading, and so doing work on the rule of law and human rights. We had a country team trying to look at development, and we had a special initiative which looked at ending cholera. Very focused on ending cholera. And then we had a statement that came out from the same UN, a little bit the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing, where we criticized the president for corruption, for human rights, on the eve that he was to stand in front of his colleagues as the chair of CARICOM, where he was to sign for the first time bringing the IMF back into the region to sort his economy out, and where in 2 days he was going to sit with the Secretary General and look at new financial instruments to invest in people and poverty. Was that the right thing to do? We could have done it better. Because what it got us was that we broke all bridges of trust overnight. And the door slammed shut on the United Nations in Haiti. It took us all of 48 hours to try to get a crack open again. We've managed to do that because of the integrity of the Secretary General, and because we tried to explain that, sometimes on this path there's some major potholes, and we go in a couple of them on that road, and this is one. But we come out, and we get stronger, and we learn more from that lesson. And I say this because it is about us trying to see that while we sense the urgency of what we have to do, it is about people, it is about institutions, it's about governments, it's about us understanding that sometimes you have to step back a step before you can go several forward. It's that whole balancing act that you have to do with everything that is urgent and important. But in some cases, you stay in the silos, you're blinkered, you do not see the effects of those actions that are well intended and other efforts to try to move the country collectively forward. So we see the pace of progress as uneven and insufficient. There's a sense of urgency, and in many places it's very palpable. And it will take a monumental effort to translate the aspirations of this 2030 agenda into reality at the community level. So how do we go from global to local? Especially when it comes to jobs, to gender, to health, education. We really can't afford to drop the ball on this one. So 4 years for us in trying to get consensus, we think a really good balance and ambition. I'm sure here you'd have heard a lot of people talk about human rights in the Charter. It's embodied in our Charter. It's an incredible Charter. We've just had the meetings in Geneva this week. But I can assure you that if we were to put the Human Rights Charter on the table and ask for that to be signed on to today, we wouldn't have it. In many, many cases, people have dropped the ball on human rights. They've thrown the Charter away, and we need to get that back in the center of the things that we do. Good thing about the development agenda, it took us about 4 years to get goal 16, and when you've got time, just look at it, because it really underscores the importance of the rule of law, of human rights, of strong institutions, always talking about the sustainability of what will keep that fabric together. What is it that will do that? And we believe this is it, but not to take it for granted. We have got so many instances where we can say, today, as we sit and we stand here, it has failed. And so, issues retain their sensitivity, adding to the overall challenge. In every case, sovereignty is what is put up in front of us in the United Nations. 193 countries who talk about their sovereignty all the time. What we have to make sure is they don't use that as an excuse to oppress their people. So our presence on the ground is incredibly important in that development, humanitarian context, to make sure that we're there for the long term. And that all the time we are progressively encouraging governments who are most oppressive or who leave their people behind to actually put them front and center. And so we need more concerted action. And we need more acknowledgement that context, even in a country, can be so different and so challenging. Current trends that we see today are still saying that more than half the world's poor are in countries that are affected by high levels of violence. And that violence across the regions can vary. We've just taken up an initiative on gender-based violence, and we see from where we will consider verbal abuse, mental abuse as gender-based violence, to where women's lives are taken in femicide. So you've got this spectrum that you have to deal with, and you have to do it in ways that each is not a cookie cutter, but we really are sensitive to those issues. I want to move a little now to talk about the Paris Agreement, because on climate change, I think whatever we agreed in Paris was phenomenal. To get countries to come to commit to looking at their economies in a different way, and every one of them in the democracies that we have today is short-term. Politicians need quick wins, and investing in climate change is a long-term commitment, generation after generation. And we're not there yet. But what was really, I think, cool about that whole Paris Agreement was that when you take it back to your countries and you are trying to figure out how you design and invest in pipelines of projects, it's all about development. And so not to think again about the Paris Agreement separately from Agenda 2030. It's an integral part of it, and there are many ways that we can contribute to it, for which each and every goal has a part to play. So there's no shortage of best practice, technologies, and good policies. I would say that for us in Africa, we no longer want to be the lab. and our countries are petri dishes. We know what it takes to get out of those petri dishes to propagate investments, to make sure that we change the lives of people. It's getting up to do that. And for that, we need to challenge the world. What we need is a means of implementation. We've seen many of our colleagues who have put on paper that this will take us $3-4 trillion a year to do that, and that we actually can go from millions to billions to trillions. But how do you unlock those resources that are needed? How do we change the way we look at investing rather than overseas development assistance? This is not, as the president of Haiti said to us, I don't want a handout, I want a handshake. How do we move from that to the other? And we get the financial systems in the world, really, instead of telling us why there's too much risk or the regulation doesn't allow them, is that they look for solutions, and that together with government, we put checks and balances in to make sure that we can invest that way. Speaking about women's empowerment, it's a further imperative. Here, when we start to talk about women, I think, sometimes the audience goes, here we go again, gender. But this is half most countries' population. I don't know a bird or a plane that flies on half a wing. It just doesn't happen. And so it is about investing in the other half. Again, it's not charity. Women's rights are human rights. And that's what we have to think about, is how do we empower women to make sure they take their rightful place? We started at the United Nations by focusing on gender parity for a number of reasons, but mostly because we believe it will change the power relations within, and we think that we will see much more progress towards results that are inclusive. Just taking, for instance, sexual harassment and sexual exploitation and abuse in the field in our missions, peace missions, we've seen that if we take this as a package, we're more likely to get to an enabling environment that we can do something about it. Today, the hashtag MeToo has woken all of us up to the reality that we are not enforcing what we believe in. And in the United Nations, we are equally guilty and putting those things in place that ensure, first of all, victims can actually report, mostly women, and that something will be done about it, that the investigative procedures that we use will actually have integrity. And last but not least, that in the end, we will be able to put zero into the tolerance and make that a reality in our places. But again, that's because we're looking for gender equality. And we're trying to find a way that we can convince people that they don't have to think of this as an add-on, but as a matter of course. We will celebrate Women's Day on March the 8th, and the focus will be on rural women. And it will just be on rural women because it's so important with a global agenda. If it truly does belong to our countries, if truly in a multilateral institution, member states are there to represent their people, is what we say, can that be taken and made a difference in their lives? And this time we bring them to the United Nations to tell us how far off track we are in achieving their aspirations. On peace and certainly peace processes, we know take deeper root when women are involved and meaningful. The Secretary General, again, we've got a mediation advisory group, half of them are women. And this has made a difference to a lot of the under the radar efforts that we make to try to bring parties together. Some cases they'll say we don't need mediation yet. Well, we don't want to wait till a time where you need it. We want to get in there before to prevent it. It's putting the prevention lens on everything, which means that we must be aware of what is happening around the world and have a barometer to know when the temperature is getting too high in a country. Liberia, recently we were celebrating the election, that there was no violence, it was peaceful, but there almost was. And if not for a mediator that went in there to try to bring the two sides together, on the day the results were announced, I think it would be much different a day than we have seen today, where I will be privileged to take down the flag on the mission, because this is a success. They no longer need peacekeeping troops. So there are plenty of reasons. Greater action is needed. It's really why we believe that having an opportunity to speak to you today is to really bring you into that discussion and hope we can sustain this conversation beyond today. How do we find a way to continuously communicate and share what we are doing both in New York, in Geneva, and at the global level with our presence? We believe that safeguarding the liberal order means living up to our collective responsibility, the commitment to find a way to make better our choices of working together rather than finding the excuses of why we can't do it. And that's become so predominant in our conversations today. I asked one world, as we say, the Security Council is held together by 5 countries, and I asked one of those countries, we were being asked in the development pillar for so much transparency and accountability. We have been asked for that accountability in the human rights pillar. So who asks for the accountability in the peace and security? When you are failing what we set to put what we put in place in 1945, who holds you accountable? Because we can't do anything in development and human rights if that one pillar is constantly cracked. And I think here we need the voices around the world who believe in multilateralism, who believe that collectively we can go further to raise those voices and not allow the isolationism, the bilateralism that is happening, unilateralism that is happening, because some 1 or 2 countries feel they can go this alone. They can't. And I think we've proved now that we need to put that, not to take it for granted, but to put multilateralism at the center of this. I'm drawing to a close, you will be relieved to know. But I think that here, maybe just to end on a personal note of how I see multilateralism working at the local level. I speak about it on the 38th floor, and we certainly write a lot of speeches and resolutions generated by member states and ourselves. But in northeast Nigeria, I went to school, primary school there. That is the same place that gave birth to Boko Haram. It is the same place we lost another 110 girls a couple of weeks ago. It is the same place we lost 4 United Nations staff three days ago. This is all the more reason why we need different parts of the world to think about not this isolated case of what is happening in northeast Nigeria, but how it is affected by the Sahel. How it will be even more affected as you make peace in Iraq and in Syria. There are those that have not won the war. They will come south. As they come south, the rest will go north. The paths are all over the place. As the IMF takes a decision on what it does with Chad, it takes a little too long. It's not urgent enough. And while it's doing that, there's no money to pay the soldiers in Chad. And those soldiers in Chad helped our border when it came to Boko Haram crossing it. So the interrelationship between everything that happens around the world, if we're talking about refugees and migrants, today, the challenge of this, there are more migrants and refugees across borders of poor countries in a week than there are in a year in Europe. Poor countries in Africa that take them on with the generosity that they have and little that they don't have, but it won't last for long. So not to fudge the lines between refugees and migrants, to understand that there are root causes and that we have to invest in them, and that terrorists were not born in northeast Nigeria. Otherwise I might have been one. But I'm not. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and anyone from anywhere in the world can rise to this position. But they need to have the right enabling environment to do so. So what happened from when I left 1970, that part of the country, to today? What do we take away from young people? That they see that their life is more beneficial to communities in the world by taking other lives. And I think we continuously feel that that is a global conversation. That is something that should happen in the Town Hall of the United Nations, so that we understand that religion shouldn't be distorted. We should have much more tolerance and respect for people's different ways of culture and religion, provided they do no harm. And that we understand what we mean by people's rights, and that mine end when yours begin, and vice versa. And that we do not fuel children seeing another career in terrorism as they do today. We find the opposite. We pull them back into join the economy, have a job that gives you dignity, that gives you respect. This is all a global responsibility. And so I hope that today, the discussions that you have had over the last few days and what we've had to add in our reflections will prove that the organization is working to promote on the ground, through our reforms, a better presence, a better platform to leverage, to facilitate people to come together. And that when we say, so is the world liberal order over? I would say, no, it's not. But multilateralism is challenged as it has never been before. And it would require all of us to really get up and put our muscle behind that. It is a collective responsibility. It is our home. It is our humanity. I thank you.
Deputy Secretary General for that really stimulating, inspiring speech. She's pressed for time. She has a tight schedule, but she's agreed to take a few questions. So let's just take 3 questions, and then she can respond.
Oh, but I have to have women. Otherwise, I'm going to take the microphone to the corners. I can find them.
So I do have women in my class, so I want to put them on the spot. Okay. And then just give your name and affiliation.
Paul Berkeley, Director of the Science Diplomacy Center. Thank you for a hopeful speech. The Sustainable Development Goals are a gift to humanity. You began your speech by introducing your children and your grandchildren. The concept of generations is explicit in the notion of sustainability. How will the United Nations project that the solutions at a global scale operate across generations, and that the thinking is involved certainly crosses the 21st century? In terms of investment, China has talked about a Belt and Road Initiative that projects across the 21st century. How can the United Nations collaborate in that long-term perspective in a hopeful way? Thank you.
Thank you for this review about the important work of the United Nations. My name is Stefan. I'm a PhD student here at the Fletcher School. I've been studying branding and communications in the United Nations for the past 2 years. And so today's topic is about how to reinforce multilateralism in the United Nations system. And I think in this room no one doubts the importance of the United Nations system. But I have a feeling that outside of these walls, what we call as the general public, many people don't even understand what the United Nations is and does, and they probably don't care about it. So my question to you is, what can the United Nations or the United Nations system as a whole do to make the general public better understand what the UN is and does, and how it can create excitement in the people's hearts and feelings for the United Nations work? Thank you.
On this side,
Thank you.
Sorry, so my question is kind of a little bit similar, but how do you promote multilateralism, especially in the world today, where you see, like at the EU, there's a few countries who are refusing to accept refugees, and where you see, especially in the United States, with Trump refusing to participate in multilateral organizations or treaties. So my question is exactly, how do you promote that when the world is changing so much?
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Samuel from the Russian Delegate. I'm originally from Nigeria. I saw a video of yours recently beside a robot called Sophie. And I wanted to know what your concerns are about the rise of AI and gender parity. And the second question is directed towards one of the comments that was made by the panelists, I think 2 days ago, saying that remittances by immigrants all over the world is 3 times more than ODAs that's been received all over the world. And I want to ask that, what is Goal 17, which is the partnership, what is it doing in line with adopting partnerships with private sectors like multinational corporations like Facebook in addressing humanitarian projects all over the world?
right? Just the last 3 and keep it short.
Hi, Ms. Mohammed. Thanks for your inspiring speech. My question is very brief. Do you see population growth as a problem or a challenge? Coming from China, there's a debate, there's a contradiction between reproductive rights and the use of contraception. So how do you see that in the United Nations?
Hi, Ms. Mohammed. My name is Evelyn. I'm from the Singapore delegation. My question is regarding whether you think investments by developed countries in developing countries can be potentially exploitative, and whether the UN can do anything to support developing countries. So, for example, China's investments in Africa has been, some people have criticized it as being exploitative. And a lot of times these developing countries don't have the mechanisms to safeguard against such exploitation. So is there anything that can be done? Thank you.
I'll try to be quick. My question is very related to some of the previous ones. How do you reinforce multilateralism, especially considering this week where Trump is announcing new tariffs and the EU is responding with their own tariffs, and then just a whole kind of lack of confidence in multilateralism in general, which is just increasing.
This is fine, great. Thank you very much. These are fantastic questions. Yes, SDGs as a gift, but they'll only be as good as they're delivered. I think at the local level, that's really so important. And I think that the generations that we speak about, already we see plans at the country level recognizing that in the longer term focus that they have. You would see 10-year plans, now you're seeing 15, 20, 25 years. In fact, the African Union is 50 years, although they have a 10-year strategy for it. And as you asked the question about BRI, that was one of the things that came up just very recently. We suddenly realized that everybody had this sense that the BRI was an amazing opportunity where the world would be connected. And infrastructure would be laid, jobs would be had, trade would happen. And so we all jumped on it. What we found in the UN was we had over 20 agencies that signed up agreements with China. What was the concern? So what did they sign up agreements for? And how was this going to help countries that would be along these routes, these two routes, both land and by sea? And that I think has been a greater challenge for us to address. So we are looking at that at the UN to see that how do we take an opportunity and make sure that no one is going to lose for not having the requisite governance and institutions that are strong enough to carry the contracts that will come to be, the standards that you expect to get, the capacities that you want within those countries. That answers the question from the young lady from Singapore, in that you're absolutely right. People will go in and exploit governments because Goal 16 underscores that we have weak government, weak institutions. We don't have the capacities. Democracy itself is weak. If you go into our countries today, it's not very difficult for you to engage with the parliament and to find yourself a line item in the budget that is totally against what the government of the day has seen as part of their plan and in their investments, and there's a total contradiction. It's a business interest, it's not a country interest investing in people. So there are weaknesses, and there are in most countries that are emerging economies, and we are making sure that in that governance goal, the capacities of the country level, the UN country team led by a resident coordinator and the reforms has those skill sets to engage with our regional economic commissions, to bring in the expertise that's needed that is country specific. But we do look from the regional level as well. This is something we've had great tensions about. How does the regional piece fit now with the country piece? There has never been that cooperation and collaboration in the UN. They've sat side by side and uncomfortably. Now we're trying to say there needs to be an integration so we can provide that support to countries and regions when suddenly there is an opportunity for road and rail and industry and energy investments, which we know very well, if they're not properly addressed, they will fall foul of the aspirations of the development agenda. Branding, right, okay. This is a major problem. How do we socialize what we do? And I think that the one thing we have to do is to learn to communicate better. We don't communicate to the outside world, we communicate to ourselves with acronyms and UNEs. Many speeches that I will pick up, I just know if I go into that audience, you won't get it. And so I will say a little bit just to give some credit to those that spent a lot of time writing the speech, and then I'll put it to one side and speak to it. But that's speaking to it. I cannot continue to do that. I had 156 speeches last year. I can't do it for every speech. But every one of those 156 audiences was key. So how do we give messages when we have you in our halls that you take out and that you can propagate? At the same time, how do we use the wealth of technology that is available at the local level and around the world to communicate what we do in real terms, make the connection of the goals in people's lives, and that's a difficult one. I think that the answer to it, and it's something that we're looking at right now, is to put a bunch of young people together in the UN to do it, because we can't do it. Over and over again, I've sort of sat on the outside and maybe sent a couple of things because I use my children as guinea pigs. So what do you think this says? Okay, it doesn't say very much. And so we are the reform of our, what we call the Department of Public Information. It even sounds like a dinosaur. Is going to have to change the way it does things. We found that we had more people in that in the radio department than we had. I think we had something like 2 people social media and like 40-something people in radio. Now radio is important in Africa and places like that. It's very important. But social media today, to ignore that phenomena, is like saying that you want to leave 80% of the world behind. It's huge, and we need to address that. So we will try as much as we can by bringing young people into that. And it's easier said than done. If women think they've got glass ceilings, young people in the world today have got concrete ones. To shift and to get the cracks to get through there and participate is one of the biggest challenges I think we have, in as much as we think it's about them today and their future. In terms of the promoting, we need to break down what we have. It's very complicated. Even the word Sustainable Development Goals, whether we made it an acronym that sounds like some virus, or it's the Sustainable Development Goals, on the outside it really doesn't make any sense. We've had a bunch of people from the music industry had to start talking to us about how about global goals? How about saying something that we can all relate to? And then we have this tension because in the United Nations, if you don't do what's agreed in the resolution, it becomes another problem. So we're having to explain to our member states that if you really want to take out what you did 4 years and get it done, not by the UN, but by the UN facilitating and convening and empowering people, then we've got to break it down. It doesn't even have a word in my language. So how would I even begin to talk about this in Nigeria? Good old Sophie. Okay, so Sophie was interesting because what it did was, first of all, I don't think anybody from the 38th floor would have normally come down and had a conversation with a robot. But it was underscoring the Secretary General's emphasis on frontier issues and exactly how the UN would engage with this. And we did a little research and we had a meeting amongst the chief executives to find out that we hadn't got a clue and that we were so far behind it was not true. To catch up would be an effort, talk less, be ahead, and to recognize that this has to be done in partnership. So we continue to have that discussion, and we are in the middle of trying to put together an advisory from outside of the UN to come and help us to at least be able to look at the frontier issues with a light on it. The dark side is getting quite big, whether we talk about bitcoins or we speak about how hard it is to see what is available for doing the wrong thing. How do we shine a light on it, and how do we become not the regulators, because we're very clear that you can't regulate that space, but how do you bring a balance to it that we could do better? Gender parity, well, we would like gender parity in everything because we think it will make a difference, a big difference. But where do you start with gender parity on frontier issues? We're not even educating girls in science. They're the last ones to think about, getting into education is a problem, talk less science. So we're really putting a focus in the UN as we try to achieve gender parity, to go out and to find the programs and to search and headhunt the girls that we can bring into the UN over the next 5 to 10 years. That, I think, is an experience and some process that we should share with governments around the world, because I think this should not just happen in the private sector. I mean, what are we doing this for? And a huge amount of numbers of people go into public sector. And women end up doing the G level. There's no professional level. And so we want to try to make sure that in the public sector we see much more of gender parity being achieved and use our own experiences with our member states in doing that. You asked a question about the remittances. And the cost of remittances is a negotiation we want with the financial systems. They're very high. So we could have even more. And so Goal 17's partnership is more than just about governments and business. It is about the financial system across north, south, east, and west, if you like, and a number of other partnerships that will unlock a lot of these resources. It worries me that people dismiss the whole cryptocurrency discussion. I think that this is a reflection of the financial systems not working, and that people are finding other ways. Unfortunately, maybe over 80% of it is used for the dark side. You can buy anything on there that is illicit. But I think that if we're not careful, we will find these parallel. They may be a little more risk, but people will use them because it's better having something than a lot of nothing. And young people will get involved. And I think that this is important, that we really think about pressuring the financial systems to understand the implications of excluding most of the world, and to bring people into that. So on goal 17, depends which part of the world you're in. Look at it in terms of the partnerships that you need to grow your economy, that it is inclusive, and that we are looking at technologies at the forefront of this. Population growth can be a huge problem, and we've seen it be a huge problem in Africa and China. I think we have to remember rights at the center of this. But I think that we also have to think about what is the best pathway for us. If you come to my country, that is going to be, I think in less than 50 years, our population is going to surpass India, we'll be second to China and Nigeria. This is frightening because we can't even feed them. So what are we going to do? I think there needs to be a really healthy discussion that allows people to understand the context and the implications and to make the right choices. And not to prescribe those choices on anyone, that we don't have a right to do that. And I think that we're not having the conversation on both sides of the table in a way to bring us together to find a solution to population that turns it into an advantage and an opportunity and not a burden. On the investments well, I think we've talked about those exploitation ones and multilateralism engaging. And in the strategic, I suppose for the UN, it really is use us because you have a right to, it's yours. Every country is a member, but yet participation with countries, where's the entry point for that? And I've been speaking to a number of my permanent representatives and saying that you're not doing a very good job. Inequality begins on the floor of the GA in the United Nations. There are 193 countries. Some countries have delegations of 20, 30 professionals that can really inform resolutions and some of the decisions we take out there for the rest of the world. The countries that matter most have 2 or 3 people. And the ones that have 30 have got probably 300 back at capital. And the ones that have 2 or 3 don't even get listened to back in their countries. And it ends up in foreign affairs. And foreign affairs is okay, but foreign affairs has got to connect with all the other sectors and all the other players so that we, in fact, what we take from the UN and how we engage with the UN is inclusive and is about the issues and not just foreign diplomacy. Foreign diplomacy, for a long while now, seems to be in another ivory tower and is not connected. We see that now, speaking across the pillars, for instance, today some of the reforms that we're taking, that we are doing in the UN has been between the political side of the House and the peacekeeping side of the House. That has been isolated before. Peacekeeping missions never had a discussion with the political side of the House until there was a problem. And so now, in the reform, bringing them closer together so that the context is clear. And is there an exit strategy that the political side is finding for our peacekeeping missions? The same for humanitarian. Is there a transition from the humanitarian crisis and conflict into sustainable development? Today, in many countries, South Sudan, DRC, the minute we get peace, we throw the ball to the development side. They drop it because there are no resources. There's no understanding of how it is that we are going to balance putting in place stronger institutions, governance, and then investing in development. So I think multilateralism, break it down, engage with it. What does it mean for your country, and what are their positions in the UN? How many of us know what our positions of our countries are? In some cases, they just go with the flow. They don't have a position. Today, as we're looking at the reforms, we're looking at the groups in what we call the group of 77 countries in the developing side of the house. And the largest group is Africa. And when G77 comes to speak to you, they'll speak to you on SIDS, another acronym for our small island developing states. They'll speak to you about the least developed countries. They'll speak to you about landlocked countries. Every one of those nomenclatures rest in Africa in the 54 countries that we have. Yet that group has not found a way to discuss and move forward with those issues. So I think in explaining multilateralism, it'll be part of our branding, part of our communication that has to improve. You won't believe that we have what we call United Nations Information Centers in over 130 countries, but I'm not sure what they're doing. And what we've done is challenge them, is to say, are you on the outside of the team or on the inside? What is it that you actually communicate? And who do you communicate with? And which entities have you engaged? from the ministries to business, because business has some money, has some muscle, and how have you influenced the way that they would continue to change their core business models, not CSR, to make communication much easier for us to go on. And I hope that this will be a conversation that we can continue. I really do thank you for giving me the opportunity to at least share a little of what we're trying to do. I hope, as the third woman to hold the Deputy Secretary General's position, that I will leave the UN better than I met it, and able to go back to my country and add a little more value than I have done over the last 35 years. Thank you.
It's no mere formality when I say that I'm deeply grateful to you for being with us today and for your inspiring and challenging speech. And of course, on a personal note, I'm so pleased that my sister, another mother, is Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and working so hard with competence, compassion, and humane values to make the world a much better place. Thank you.